Alright, in this video I'm going to be going over creating volumetric effects within Blender for lighting. So to do this, all I'm going to do is I'm going to press Shift A, and I'm going to add a mesh. This mesh will act as the bounding box for the the volume. It's important to note that it's based that this is all based on the bounding box of the volume and not anything else. So if I was to go in here and add a extrusion of this section, then the volume will cover this extrusion and fill in these gaps because it's looking at the bounding box of the object and not the actual mesh. And it's not constrained to the mesh. There's a way to do it, but it's kind of a pain in the butt. Anyway, as compared to everything else at least. So anyway, to this material that this object that we added has the default material. So if I go over to the right here and I click New, then I can go in and I can see that this is currently principled VSDF, which looks the same. I'm going to rename this to Volume 1. And I'm going to click on Surface and switch this over to Principled Volume. Now, sorry about this. Let me collapse these windows. I mean, you should already have seen this if you went through the basic Blender thing. But anyway, if I click on the corner here and drag outward, I can drag open a new window. If I then click on this editor type, I can then go down to shader editor, and here we go. Now I have the shader editor for whatever object that I currently have selected. So from here, you can see that this volume is completely black. That's because this volume is going to the wrong input shader. That's just how Blender views this little surface node, or this user interface. So now if I click on surface, I can unconnect that, and I'm going to plug it into volume, and there you go. We have a basic volume. Now, of course, it's flickering a lot, and volumes are going to flicker when you move the viewport. They're going to become more accurate or better once you stop moving. Sometimes it's best just to hide all the volumes within a separate collection and not worry about them except during rendering or when you're doing tests and all that sort of stuff. So anyway, I'm going to scale up this object by pressing S, and I'm going to move it out a little bit. So it's just kind of covering this area. Apologies if this flickering is making you feel a little bit queasy. That's why I said it might be just best to hide them and only worry about it when you're doing test renders. Anyway, so you can see that the fog is now volumetric, and it's now affecting everything that you see. So we have a few options here within this, and then we have a few options with the scene settings to do with volumetrics. So the first one is going to be color. You can change the base color of the fog. So you can have a creepy, weird blue fog, or a green fog, or whatever. I usually keep it to white because usually I'm working with steam. Volumetrics can also, of course, be used for smoke. So if you have this near black gray, you would use that for smoke. We'll get into those effects a little bit later, but that should be handled, well, probably by me on a case-by-case basis, but I'll show someone how to do it. Also, the animation team is dealing with effects to do with smoke, explosions, and all that sort of stuff. The only reason that you have to know volumetrics is because you're lighting the environment, and environments sometimes require volumetrics. Anyway, so color attribute. This is if you were doing like a hexagonal color input, and you were to type it out. I believe, I haven't used it, but that is what I've heard. So anyway, density here. You can change the density of the fog. So I'm just going to decrease this a little bit from 1 to 0.3, and we've got sort of a nice light density fog that goes in this scene. Absorption color. you can change the absorption color. And absorption color specifically does the volume shadow color tint. So it'll slightly tint this shadow over here, but also its effects are slightly mitigated. Anisotropic has to do with how light reflects through the volumetric fog. So it's kind of hard to describe, but in seeing it, you'll see it makes a lot of sense. It's not necessarily the absorption of it, but how it refracts light. Anyway, I'm going to set this back to black. And then we have emission color, so you can have the emission color and strength, my bad. So you can have the volume itself emit light. This is good for fire. Next, black body tint, temperature, and black body intensity have to do with with fire and explosions. These are settings you'll only really work with when you're actually doing fire, and you don't have to worry about them for lighting purposes at least. These settings down here don't actually do anything with volumetrics fog. These settings are general settings that are applied to every material. If you wish to not be able to click on this object directly, as can be useful in scenes, if you go up to the top right here, where it says filter, it looks like a little filter. You click on that and you enable the restriction toggle for whether or not it's selectable. And now if I turn this off so it can't select the object within the viewport, then now I can click on the rest of my scene items without worry. Then I can either click on it directly, or I can turn back on selectable and click on the object within the viewport in order to access all the settings and stuff to do with materials. Anyway, just to show one other concept that I tried to talk about earlier, volumetrics looks at the bounding box. So if I was to extrude this out, you can see that, the volumetrics is affected by the bounding box of the mesh and not the actual geometry. Anyway, just to give you a little bit more interest in this has to do with more materials than anything else. But if I go in here and I add a noise texture, I can then take the FAQ and turn that into the density, and now I get varied fog density. Of course, it's kind of hard to see, but as I scale this up, you can see a little bit easier. With a lot of vector changes and some other stuff, this can be very nicely used to create procedural clouds, which might be in lighting team's domain, or it might be in layout team's domain. It kind of depends. We'll go into that a little bit more later, but I would think it would be lighting team. Anyway, that's just an example of how you can vary the density based on that. And then, of course, if I extend that out, add a color ramp, then I can change the intensity of it and change each level. So it takes a black and white input, black to the left, white to the right, and I can change how they're gradiated. So, I can have this really cotton-looking fog or something like that. Anyway, I won't go into it any further than that for the density and changing all that sort of stuff. Anyway, going up here, I'm going to go to scene settings, and I have volumetric shadows and volumetric lighting enabled. The volumetric lighting should be enabled by default, but yeah. Anyway, volumetric start and end, so this has to do with clipping distance of the fog and all that sort of stuff. I believe this is set to the scene nominal. So, yeah, don't worry about it. If you need to change it, I'll mention it. Currently, tile size is at 2, however, default is, I believe, at 8 pixels. Tile size has to do, and you can catch a glimpse of it, with the size of each one of these renders. So you can see that it's 8 pixels tall. So to get a finer resolution, you may have to decrease to 4 or even 2. Sampling rates, this is automatically set at 64. However, you may need to increase it. Each sample is each one of these lines that you can see in here. So I might turn this up to 128 for rendering. So now you can see that it creates a higher res render. And because I've changed it, I'm getting a little bit less flickering. However, the flickering is still there. And it's most obvious when you look at it at some like oblique angle. Anyway, I'm going to change that back to 64 just for performance reasons. And then distribution here. You can distribute samples closer to the camera or farther away from the camera. 0.8, I believe, is the default. And so I'm just going to leave it at that. Volumetric lighting, as you can see by enabling and disabling it, has to do with how the fog reacts to light, whether or not it's actually, being affected by light. Volumetric shadows has to do with shadows behind objects and behind lights. So whether or not you create basically God rays. This is very, very useful for creating God rays to enable that. And of course, shadow samples has to deal with how many samples the shadows themselves get. So, play with that as you will, but 16 seems to work pretty good for most applications. Light clamping, this has to do with maximum light contribution to the shadow, the fog. So it kind of clamps it vertically, but 0 is unlimited, so as much light as possible can be added to this. Anyway, that's all for volumetrics for the moment, and just adding fog and shadows to scenes. Next video, I'm going to be going over HDRIs and then introducing the add-on that I'll be sending you called Physical Atmosphere, which with a few clicks of a button gives you a physical atmosphere that you can work with. The guy actually wrote his own math, like not completely from scratch, but very, very original math and stuff like that. I can't fucking speak. I must apologize. For atmospheric rendering in a realistic but yet possible to stylize way.